Good evening. It's Joyful Christian Hermit. I'm going to do an addendum to my previous video on about being a victim soul, or about pain praying with pain. I have various comments to make. One is that God does not bring us suffering, but situations do, people do, sins do, we do, accidents do, life situations, but God allows. There is suffering in life, and love and suffering are intertwined, and they together have a great power, grace, and energy to them, physically, actually, in reality, and it's very utilizable. So while God doesn't bring us suffering, doesn't lay it on us, He allows and He utilizes it for good, especially when we freely offer it. Freely given, freely offer, freely gifted. So, and then I mentioned the word mortification, and I didn't discuss that. But mortification, it really means like dying to the flesh, dying to ourselves. To mortify oneself is to humble down. And the word mort, death is in there. So that's where you get the attitude of dying to self, of giving over. And we Christians give ourselves over to Christ. And we recognize that death is part of life. And suffering is a form, in a way. Pain and suffering. It can lead to death, and ultimately everyone is going to die. We're all going to suffer and die. Unless, I guess, some persons who fall asleep die in their sleep. So there may not be pain, or they maybe have a heart attack and have just a second or two of pain, not even recognize. I died under anesthetic during a surgery. So that was not really conscious suffering to me. So, but there is a type of, with pain, or like being sick, there is a dying involved to it, of letting go of our normal activities, of what we want to be doing or thinking of, and the suffering can be chronic, can be permanent, can be severe, can be not so much, but still limiting, or temporary, or even situational. Or, as I've mentioned, sufferings of being with someone, married to someone, or have a child, or a parent that we are helping to care for, or responsible for totally. That can be a suffering, also a limitation type, a mortification. And mortification of the mind and the heart and the soul, of the emotions in the soul, that is a humbling, an acceptance, and a dying to our own will, our own wants, our pride, thinking, why should this happen to me? I ought to be living longer, or I ought to be healthy, or I ought to be over this. Why did I catch this variety? I just got a text from a family member. She got sick, but it's some kind of a coughing kind. Mine hasn't been that. So I'm immediately praying that hers will be over quickly. But I have to accept, with arachnoiditis, thus far, anything I've gotten that is a virus, or a bacterial virus even, lasts a lot longer and affects me more. Not only age, but because of the arachnoiditis being a neurological problem with my spine, my nerves in the spine. So mortification is important and is part of. And that was the word that I was introduced to at first. It altered my view of suffering even more, and brought me face to face and talking with these religious sisters at a convent in my hometown. So, and that was the first time I really was around anyone religious in the Catholic Church like that. So, and I learned a great deal. It really opened my eyes to suffering, and in a positive way, and that it can be utilized. So suffering with a purpose is a very powerful and a wonderful vocation. It's an honor. It's an honor to suffer, and not to glorify suffering, but to have the attitude of the positivity of suffering and love, and it being utilized, being offered to God to use as He wills. Now, I wanted to mention talking to priests or ministers about this victim soul. Even the term young priests depends on their mindset, their attitude, their own vocational view. I've heard people comment that, they mentioned being a victim soul, or asked a priest, had they heard of it before? And the priest did not take well to it and was very opposed, and leave that stuff alone. That's outdated. The church has gotten rid of that, or whatever. Negative response. So the person totally pushed away from it, and as far as I know, are still just suffering. So I would be, it was a priest, though, who told me about it. Victim soul, actually. The religious sisters didn't bring that term up. But they talked about different saints that suffered, talked about different saints to me, and gave examples of those who had suffered, and also the aspect of offer your suffering to God to use for people, for situations, for souls, even souls on the other side who've already died but who haven't reached pure love. The perfection of God is pure love yet, to the point that they can be united with God. We have to be pure in order to be united to purity. God, who is pure, cannot have impure added to him, or he would not be pure anymore. So it's just, I always use the example of a clear glass of water and another one beside it, but has just a little drop of black ink in it, or food dye in it. Just a pinhead on it of dye. And that water will be tainted. It won't be pure anymore. So if you pour that, though, into the other glass that's pure, then that taints that. God, being perfect and being love, being pure love, will not unite with our souls until we are pure love. That's why he wants us to practice, and Jesus talked of that, the greatest commandment. The greatest commandment, love God above all things, and love others as we love ourselves. And we should love ourselves as God loves, purely. Not with pride, not love ourselves with selfishness or ego or anything like that, but pure love, and love others that way, purely as God loves. And of course, I'm not there yet, but the more I become aware, and the more I practice, and the more I grasp the concept, and the more I also understand, here's something else I didn't mention in the first video on victims. The more we suffer with love, and don't fight it, I'm getting patient with this ailment I have now, not noticing much. As I said, I'm not as focused on it, not bothered by it, because I'm adapting to it. But also, I'm reminded that pain and suffering has always brought gifts with it. It's always taught me something. It's improved the virtues. Like this time, I'm much more peaceful and patient with the suffering. I'm at peace with it. And even though I'm trying different things to get better, but not in any kind of a desperate way, and I'm not disappointed if they don't work. But, this has taken years of different kinds of sufferings. And the same with my body pain. I have accepted it. I did quite a while ago. And once I did, I made far more progress in the beautiful purpose that pain can be and suffering. That being a victim soul is a lovely vocation. Yes, it hurts. But what vocation doesn't hurt? What vocation doesn't have drawbacks with it? Temporal ones. In education, teaching, you're going to have some kids that are problems or parents that are problems. It can be worse. The parents can be at times. Or problems with other teachers. There's always, with life, there's going to be pain. While on earth, we shall know earthly pain. And the suffering can be in different degrees, but it will be less and less. I've noticed, seems that way, except physically, of course. For me, it's more and more as I age. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, most of the time, I don't even think about it. Unless I get something added to it that aggravates the base pain, then it takes me a while to embrace it all and to get used to it all and to move the mind away and onto the purpose, onto what my work is. Get back to work, I say. Get back to work. Visualize, offer, mentally. And it's good to start out even with specific people to have in mind, or situations, or world peace, but also small little things, small things. People that no one knows except for a few, the humble little ones, the Anawim, the poor, but even specific people we know, or ones we see in the news or hear about, or groups we may think about in other countries who are having some kind of wars or dictatorships and the suffering the people have, or volcanoes or earthquakes, any kind of sufferings that people will go through, or even lots of crime. Countries with high crime rates and poverty. So that helps, I think, in the training of the mind to offering our physical prayer, our physical pain, and all the other types of pain that isn't physical, that aren't physical. And so that we can focus then. And it's to help get the mind away from self, to mortify, away from our own suffering, and recognize the great responsibility and opportunity we've been given in this vocation. And yes, it's a vocation that other people don't know about. And the one that was leaving a lot of criticisms, which I appreciate constructive criticism, but it got a little bit not so constructive. But one was that I was boasting about being a victim soul, and how no victim souls who were holy or saints ever boasted about being a victim soul. In fact, they never spoke of it. They would never admit they were a victim soul. Well, that may be true. I've noticed things in the Catholic Church and of times that I've been told, oh, don't say a word, don't tell anyone. And it depends on the priest. But I think the church is losing some of that. It was a medieval practice, and it was supposedly a sign of humility. Humility. That you never said a word. Well, I wasn't boasting about being a victim soul. But when God told me, this is way back, and he said this, meaning all that he was doing with me, this is not just for me. He said, this is not just for you. This is for everyone. And I was to write. Well, I'm sharing, I'm talking now. I have wrote in the blog a lot. But other people who may be victim souls or may be able to enrich their own souls and find purpose in their suffering through asking God, am I a victim soul? Or saying, I would like to be, or I would like to try. If you would like me to try, Lord, I would be willing to try the vocation of victim soul. And then start praying for people. And you imagine your pain and wrap it in a box even with a bow on it. And visualize yourself giving your pain as prayers, a beautiful gift just to another person, giving the energy and the power of the pain. And pray it as a beautiful gift, and you're not giving your pain to someone, but the power and the love of the suffering that you are bearing like Christ did. He suffered and bore horrific pain and death for us. And we can do that for others. But we're utilizing our pain as the energy and power that it is and the love that it is. As a prayer for God to utilize, and he will offer that to God as he wills and wants. But God doesn't mind if we offer it on behalf of this or that person who we know is suffering. And ask God to please utilize our pain on their behalf. Our love and our energy and power of this suffering for the benefit of another to be healed, for their good, or for whatever it is that they're suffering for, that they will benefit by it. That if they have a lesson they can learn, or a grace, or a virtue, or some way that their souls will be improved by being able to handle their suffering, to cope with it even. That can be part of the prayer of what we want our suffering to be used for. Because I've already stated in the other, and we saw an example even of energy. It came out with the devil, negative energy. But then when the camera moved, shook, my first instinct was that was God trying to do emphasize what I was saying then. Pay attention to this. That when we do sin, there's consequence for it. And if we turn from God and from the being part of the body of Christ, that's an affront against Christ, who's the head of the body, we risk eternal damnation. So that would be something God would want us to know. The devil wouldn't want us to know that. The devil wants us with him in hell. So, and it's, you can think of it in a temporal way, all this, or in a spiritual way. I tend to move into a spiritual way, but we always express it with words that are more temporal. So these are some aspects that, you can expect priests or ministers might totally be against victim soul or being a victim of love. And they may think, stay away from that. That's dangerous, or that's a flawed thinking, or warped or something. But it's been for centuries. But it was great. Victim souls were greatly written about, and a society formed, like a community, a religious community in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it did fall away then. The terminology of victim soul, and it was more suppressed because it can be misunderstood. And I think that the church was trying to get away from that. And they don't want people misunderstanding suffering either, to think that, or to try to get more suffering, thinking that will even be better. We have to keep sensible. But I think I spoke about it in the last video more in depth and have built the basis of how we see that there is power and energy in the spiritual life, but especially in love and in suffering, how they are linked together, and how powerful is prayer when we lend our love and our sacrifice of suffering, when we're willing to bear the suffering and lend our suffering with Christ, to try to suffer and approach our suffering as Christ suffered and approached it, how he did, which was with courage and as a servant, and with love, mortifying himself and offering himself as a holy, living holocaust for our sake, for our lives, for our eternity, for salvation. He was a living, holy, breathing sacrifice. And that's what, sort of in a nutshell, is a victim soul's role. Except we are offering our pain in essence, but in a reality, because pain is a reality. But understand, we can't literally take it and see it turn into power and energy right there and love. But we can, through our spirit, our spiritual life, and supernaturally then. And I mentioned the vicarious suffering. And we can offer ourselves. It's up to God if he chooses and how long he chooses for. Padre Pio had a spiritual daughter and her sister that he wrote to when he was a priest. Well, he was always a priest, but before he went to San Giovanni Rotondo, the devil was setting up blocks for him to go back to the monastery. But also Padre Pio had reservations. It was as if he sensed, or maybe knew, had foreknowing, probably, of what all was going to be asked of him by God, spiritually and for the church, was suffering. But he was also very sensitive. He was The oldest son, he was attached to his mother and father. He was very loving. He had had to serve in World War I, which was horrific for him. And he kept having ailments that would keep him from returning to the monastery. He was already a priest, but World War I had interrupted things. So he was allowed to be at home to recuperate. And but then there was always these blocks for him to go to the monastery, including partly him. He partly was resisting. So, but he was writing to this woman and to his spiritual director, who was at first Father Benedetto. He was very close. And then Father Benedetto got taken away from him as his spiritual director, which was upsetting. And he was given Father Agostino, who was in the monastery, because his superiors were trying to get him to come to the monastery and begin in earnest his monastic vows. He's already a monk. So these women knew about it because Father Agostino was in touch with them. And the one made an offering of herself. She offered to God herself whatever God wanted of her for as a sacrifice of love for Padre Pio to go to the monastery where he was supposed to go and be. That was his vocation. And it happened. Padre Pio ended up going to the monastery, stopped resisting, and he also stopped having these illnesses that kept prohibiting. And some demonic interference also he was having, for sure, because the devil knew what was ahead. So he got there, and it was shortly after that he had the stigmata. He had that experience with the stigmata. And his whole monastic life was greatly altered. So I think that, well, what happened with the woman then, I'm trying to think of her first name, but, and I got this because I have the volumes of his letters. I think you can get them more easily now. Back when I was trying to get them, they were just being published, but I got them and read them with great interest, and this was all in that, what had happened. She got cancer and died. And she knew, though, God let her know, the Holy Spirit let her know that was it, that she had fulfilled her purpose, her mission. Her sacrifice of love for Padre Pio, because of the mission that he had in his life, was fulfilled. So she was able to go to heaven. Because as I've said many times, God doesn't view suffering the way we do. He utilizes suffering. He utilizes it because it's power and energy and love. So it's very utilizable and for good. We just don't consider it that. But when we all die, those of us who love God and believe in God, you'll be just amazed at how wonderful it is, how simple and how great and just glorifying. Love and laughter and joy, and everything goes with us except our bodies. And the older we get, we get more ready. So, but even young people, like my cousin, his life had a purpose. And part of that was to shake up some people around him. His dad, mainly. And it did. And it freed his mother. And then eventually his dad straightened out more. But it wasn't good. And his dad eventually then had a deeper conversion and became born-again Christian and stopped drinking and apologized to the mother, my aunt, for how he had been in their marriage, but they divorced, thankfully. It wasn't good. And that was all around the time. It was right before, well, Philip passed, and then these things happened. It all unfolded. My uncle's, in essence, a bigamist with a young woman, just 3 or 4 years older than his daughter, Philip's older sister. And the aunt didn't know it, but my aunt didn't know, obviously, but she got a call. And, well, my uncle refused to sign the insurance papers for my cousin's, all the hospital costs, didn't sign anything, didn't help pay for the funeral. And my aunt paid for all that. She went back to school. She went back, got her master's so she could earn more. And, she did all this and handled everything. He had previously helped him out when he was in big trouble, her husband, with having embezzled from a job he was on and to keep him from prison. Got a call, and this young woman that he was with said, even my little girls call him daddy, and why are you not giving him a divorce? And my aunt knew nothing of it. Well, he was an insurance salesman, so he traveled and had excuses for being away, but she says, well, I knew nothing of it. I've not ever stopped him from a divorce, but he sure has one now, she said. And that was that. But all of this was precipitated by my cousin's sickness and passing. Came on suddenly, this cancer, and was horrific. But we could also see, how my uncle was responding, and of course broken up, but not in a normal mode. But I'll talk about this in another video. I've said that before. There's somebody came back, and a nun did, and said different ways why people die. Basically it's for a purpose, always for a good purpose, but not the way we view things. We don't view things the way God does, but we're asked to try to learn that, to get to know God well enough to see how God sees. Man looks at the outer appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. The Lord looks at the inner. No, Lovey. Did he just cut this off? No, he didn't. You're not to touch this laptop. You're not to. I'll be done. So anyway, that happened with Padre Pio. This woman gladly mortification, offered herself as a victim of love to help in whatever way God would need. Offered herself as a living sacrifice. She didn't know what was going to happen, but something totally different could have happened that would have been, in our human view, very pleasing. But if you've died, you understand that is pleasing. She was an older woman, but suffering is love, and love is suffering. It rolls one into the other and back. It flows, and eternity is a reality that is glorious. So, and this suffering we have on earth, we can make it hell. We can view it as hell. We can focus on it all the time, or we can offer ourselves and our suffering for good, for God to utilize, for others, and for the world, for situations. And also, all the time, it is improving our own souls. I am not the same person I was years ago. suffering hones us. It's like, it's like being buffed and buffed, and the impurities burnished out of us. So, and we learn a lot, and we become close to God in even in the worst of sufferings. It's very, very gradual, at least it was for me, but my sharing this is not to boast, but I don't believe in being quiet about, and I don't think God would have told me this is not just for you, this is for everyone, and told me to write if I wasn't to share these things. How would people find out? How would have I found out if that priest hadn't told me about victim souls? And then I put it together. And well, he told me that I was one, but I had to think about it like, whoa, And it did upset me and freak me out just because of what I read at first. It just seems so horrific. And the responsibility of it just hit me. But I guess it was as well, just get the truth out there. It is a responsibility, but it's not a heavy one. It's once you understand suffering as not an evil or a horrible thing, but it still gets to me. It still can hurt. I can have my blue moments of thinking that I didn't have much of a regular life, or that I missed out on this and that and the other thing. And I can think negatively, well, I'm just like a battery hooked up, and not functional really, haven't achieved, or even didn't have fun things, couldn't travel, well, I did eventually, but I would always suffer as a result. But it was always, God would allow me to go if I had a purpose and if there was a mission involved. So, and something to learn that he wanted. But otherwise, no. So if I was needed for some reason, like being there for my dad's death, that ended up, I was needed there to help raise the atmosphere from people going down, getting very, very upset and depressed and anxious, and my dad wouldn't have had such a gorgeous passing. And he was a very good-natured man, so it made all the difference because I had this knowledge and, could make these suggestions to of beautiful things to do and to sing. And so it all worked out well. And it's not me, you understand. It's not me, it's the Holy Spirit. But I wouldn't have known these things without being a victim soul, without having died, without having suffered a lot, and then doing a lot of reading also. So I'm sharing. I don't consider it boasting. Suffering is nothing to boast about. I still have, moments of great like doubt. I'll go through a doubt, like, why did I have to have this? What did I do? Well, I did plenty, but I understand God chose me for this. This is my purpose, my calling. And it sounds strange, but I can look back. I had prayed that prayer. God, use me however you want. And I meant it. I had no idea about suffering or what was to come. But he knew my heart, and he knew that I was teachable. And so are you all, anyone. So if you get a chance, you'll find that blog, Victim Soul of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And then you can learn more of different aspects of victim soul. But this is my little addendum that I had, I think I don't talk about it with people in general. I'm sharing here, but I don't, it's a little bit too much for most people. But if there's someone who's suffering and who seems interested, yes, then I'll share about it. But it's one of those things. I think God sort of leads us to who can understand, and then the ones who don't, they forget about it. I've noticed that. Like if there's been anyone that I thought would be very interested, could maybe help others who suffer through understanding this victim soul role and purpose and pain praying. But if they don't understand, or if they're not going to, it's like they just have a shield put across them, a foggy windshield that they haven't cleared off. And you just move on then. You don't keep trying to explain to them. If they ever ask, then fine, but we can make mistakes in what we share or who we share them with. And then those people tend to forget what we said, what I said. I've noticed that if it's not time for them to know something, or they're not going to understand, or it's upsetting to them, they'll tend to block it anyway. They might listen, but block it. Okay, I've talked enough. God bless His real presence in us, and leave questions if you have them.